The rain fell like shattered glass that night when Elijah Brooks burst through the sliding doors of St. Martin's Hospital, clutching his chest, gasping for air, his boots still muddy from a long shift at the construction site. The waiting room froze for a second, then went back to its rhythm, everyone pretending not to see the black man collapsing in front of them. "Please," Elijah managed to whisper, his voice trembling. "I need help." But the nurse behind the counter didn't even look up from her paperwork. "Take a seat, sir. The doctor's busy," she muttered, just as a white man with a small bandage on his hand was ushered straight to the emergency ward. Elijah's vision blurred. Every heartbeat felt heavier, slower. He stumbled, his breath catching like a trapped bird in his chest. That's when a young nurse, Maria, noticed him. "He's having a heart attack," she shouted, rushing to his side. They wheeled him through the sterile white corridors under the cold buzz of fluorescent lights, straight into the trauma bay, where Dr. Collins, a senior physician with slicked back hair and eyes colder than the steel tools around him, stood waiting. He didn't even glance at Elijah at first. "Who authorized this?" he barked. "He has no insurance," the receptionist called from the door. Dr. Collins sighed, folding his arms. "Then why is he here? We don't treat people like this without insurance. You know the policy." Maria froze. "He's dying," she cried. Dr. Collins' expression hardened. "Then let him." "We're not a charity." Elijah's trembling hand reached out, his voice barely a whisper. "Sir, please. I helped build this hospital. The children's wing." But the doctor turned away. The heart monitor's beeps grew frantic, then flatlined. The sound cut through the room like a blade. Maria's hands shook as she tried to revive him, but it was too late. His eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, lifeless. The room went silent except for the soft hum of machines. And then, something fell from Elijah's pocket. An old wallet, a photo of a little boy, and a laminated donor card. Maria picked it up, her breath catching as she read the name. Elijah Brooks, lead foreman, St. Martin's Children's Wing Expansion Project. Her eyes widened in horror. He wasn't just a patient. He was the man who helped build this hospital, the one whose work had saved countless children, including Dr. Collins' own son. Maria stormed into the doctor's office, tears streaming down her face, and slammed the card on his desk. "You remember this name?" she demanded. Dr. Collins frowned, took the card, and his face turned pale. Maria's voice trembled with rage. "This is the man who built the room your son recovered in. You let him die on the floor because of the color of his skin." The words hit him harder than any sound of thunder outside. His eyes flicked toward the hallway, where the nurses were quietly covering Elijah's body with a white sheet. The same man he refused to treat had given life to the very place he stood in, and now lay dead because of his prejudice. The storm outside roared louder, lightning flashing across the windows like judgment itself. For the first time, Dr. Collins' confident posture broke. His hands shook, his throat dry. He wanted to speak, to explain, but there was nothing left to say. The heart monitor in the next room beeped steadily, a cruel reminder of the heartbeat he'd silenced. And as the hospital lights flickered from the thunder, Maria's voice echoed softly in the corridor, almost like a prayer. "Karma doesn't miss, doctor. Sometimes it just waits for the right name." The morning started like any other in the heart of the city. The steady hum of engines, horns echoing through the mist, and men in work boots heading to job sites with coffee in one hand and tired hope in the other. Elijah Brooks, a 47-year-old construction foreman, was one of them. To his crew, he was the man who never took a day off, the one who patched up broken machines, bought lunch for the young guys, and never once complained about the weather or the pay. But that morning, the world felt heavier. A deep, burning pressure had been growing in his chest since dawn, pulsing like a hidden warning. He ignored it, as he always did. There was still concrete to pour and deadlines to meet. By noon, the sun had burned through the clouds, heat radiating off steel beams, and Elijah's heart pounded like it was fighting to stay alive. When his coworker noticed his pale face and trembling hands, Elijah brushed it off with a laugh, saying it was just the heat. Minutes later, he collapsed beside the foundation he'd been building, clutching his chest as pain tore through him like a blade. The next thing he knew, he was in the back of an ambulance, sirens wailing, lights flashing across his drenched face. Through half-closed eyes, he caught a glimpse of the hospital ahead, St. Martin's Medical Center, the same one he'd helped build years ago, the project he'd poured his sweat and pride into. Inside those walls, his fingerprints still lived on the beams and floors, the bricks he'd laid himself. As the doors burst open and the paramedics wheeled him into the emergency room, Elijah's mind flickered with one thought. He was going to be okay. He was in the place he built with his own hands, but the warmth of that hope vanished as soon as he saw the faces staring back at him. The receptionist's eyes darted from his dark skin to his construction clothes and stopped caring before she even spoke. Her tone was clipped, impatient. "Name, insurance?" she demanded while he struggled to breathe. He tried to explain, voice thin and shaking, that his wallet was in his work bag, that he was in pain, that he'd built this place. But she didn't hear him. Or maybe she just didn't want to. Behind him, a well-dressed man with a small cut on his palm was immediately ushered in for treatment. And that was when Elijah understood. The hospital that bore the weight of his work did not see him as a man worth saving. Minutes dragged by. The air felt colder. People stared but said nothing. Then through the blur of light and pain, he saw a nurse. Maria. Young. Tired, with kind eyes that still had some fight left in them. She rushed forward, shouting for help, demanding a stretcher. The orderlies hesitated, uncertain, until she snapped, "Move now!" As they rolled him toward the trauma bay. Elijah's vision dimmed, the hallway lights stretching into lines of white. He heard footsteps, the clatter of metal trays, and then a voice. Calm, clipped, detached. Dr. Collins, the senior physician, tall and immaculate in his pressed white coat, stepped into view. His eyes scanned Elijah once, then turned to Maria. "Did he sign the forms? Does he have insurance?" he asked, voice flat as stone. Maria shook her head. "He's having a cardiac event," she said. "We don't have time for paperwork." Dr. Collins sighed, looked at Elijah again, at his calloused hands, his boots still speckled with mud, and then said the words that would hang in the air like poison. "We don't treat people like him without coverage. You know the rules." Elijah tried to lift his head, his heart racing faster than the monitor beside him. People like him. He'd heard it before. On the job, in stores, whispered in lines, but never when his life depended on it. The pain in his chest sharpened, spreading like fire. Maria's voice cracked as she pleaded for authorization, but Dr. Collins only shook his head, muttering something about policy and responsibility. As the argument rose and the machines beeped faster, Elijah's gaze wandered to the ceiling, to the faint crack in the plaster he remembered patching years ago during construction. He thought about the children's wing he helped finish, the one he told his wife would stand long after he was gone. The irony cut deeper than the pain in his chest. He was dying inside the very building he'd helped create, surrounded by walls that remembered his labor, yet treated like a stranger. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, a low, steady sound that seemed to echo his heartbeat fading beneath the chaos. And as his vision blurred into white light, one question burned quietly in the back of his mind. If the man who built the foundation isn't worth saving, what is this place really built on? Maria's voice echoed through the sterile room as she argued with Dr. Collins, her hands still trembling from the shock of how casually he'd dismissed a dying man. Elijah lay on the gurney between them, his breath shallow, the heart monitor spitting out uneven beeps that warned of what was coming. Yet the doctor stood motionless, clipboard in hand, unmoved. "You can't just watch him die," Maria cried, her eyes burning with disbelief. "He needs immediate cardiac intervention." Dr. Collins didn't even look up, his tone icy and unbothered. "Do you have any idea how many people fake pain for free treatment? If we treat everyone who walks in off the street, this place will go bankrupt." Elijah tried to speak, but his throat closed around the words. Every inhale felt like glass cutting through his chest. The edges of his vision dimmed, but he could still see Maria leaning over him, whispering softly, "Stay with me, sir. You're going to be okay." She turned again to the doctor. "Please, just 10 minutes. That's all I'm asking." Dr. Collins sighed and finally stepped closer, his shadow falling across Elijah's face. "You people always think rules don't apply to you," he said under his breath, the words sharp and poisonous. Maria froze, her lips parting, unable to believe what she'd just heard. "What did you just say?" she asked, her voice low, trembling with anger. The doctor didn't repeat himself. He simply turned away, calling to an intern to prepare for another patient, a wealthy businessman who had arrived with a minor injury. Maria stood rooted to the floor, torn between fear of losing her job and the horror of letting a man die. Elijah's body convulsed once, a strangled gasp leaving his lips. Instinct took over. She grabbed the crash cart and began chest compressions. "Stay with me," she shouted. The monitor screamed, but Dr. Collins barked from the doorway. "That's enough, nurse. I didn't authorize resuscitation. If you can't follow orders, you can collect your things by morning." Maria's hands didn't stop. "You can fire me later," she snapped, "but right now this man is still alive." Sweat beaded down her forehead as she worked, counting each compression, silently begging Elijah to fight. Somewhere in the hallway, orderlies and nurses began to gather, drawn by the shouting. Some watched, others whispered, but no one intervened. In that moment, the difference between right and wrong was as visible as the line on the heart monitor. A line that could vanish at any second. The injustice hung thick in the air, choking the room as much as Elijah's failing lungs. Maria reached for the defibrillator paddles, but the machine wasn't charged. The doctor had unplugged it earlier. "You're wasting time," Dr. Collins muttered, his voice void of humanity. Elijah's eyes fluttered open for a brief second, his gaze meeting Maria's. In that fading moment of clarity, he whispered, "Don't stop." And she didn't. Tears streaked down her face as she kept pressing, her arms shaking from exhaustion. Around her, the other staff stood frozen, trapped between obedience and conscience. The heart monitor beeped slower, then stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. Maria lowered her head, her hand slipping from his chest, a tear landing on his work-worn shirt. Dr. Collins exhaled heavily, turning to leave. "You see?" he said coldly. "All this effort for nothing." Maria stared at him in disbelief, every ounce of respect she'd once had for the man gone forever. "He could have lived if you had done your job," she whispered. The doctor didn't reply. He simply walked out, adjusting his watch as if the last 10 minutes hadn't destroyed something sacred in that room. The nurses began to drift away quietly, their faces pale, the sound of thunder rolling faintly outside like an accusation. Maria stood alone beside the lifeless man, guilt clawing at her heart. She gently reached for his hand. It was calloused, scarred, the hand of someone who had spent a lifetime building things that lasted. She thought about the way he had whispered about building the hospital itself, about how no one in the room cared to hear it. Out of habit, she reached into his jacket pocket to retrieve his ID, and when the worn wallet fell open, she saw a laminated card and a folded photograph of a little boy sitting on his shoulders, both smiling beneath a half-finished building. The name printed on the card made her breath catch. Elijah Brooks, lead foreman, St. Martin's Children's Wing construction project. Her knees went weak as the realization struck. The man who had died on this table had helped build the very foundation of the hospital, the same children's wing the staff praised for saving lives. He had poured his blood and sweat into a place that refused him compassion. The injustice wasn't just cruelty, it was betrayal. Maria's tears blurred her vision as she looked back at his still face. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. In the hallway, thunder cracked louder this time, shaking the windows. Somewhere down the corridor, Dr. Collins's voice echoed faintly as he bragged to another doctor about efficiency and procedure, completely unaware that karma was already stirring, quiet, invisible, and patient. The next morning, the hospital buzzed with unease, whispers slipping through corridors like a spreading fire. Maria hadn't slept. Her uniform was still stained from the night before, but her eyes burned not with exhaustion but with purpose. She clutched Elijah's wallet and donor card in her trembling hands as she marched into the boardroom where Dr. Collins stood addressing the administrators about policy compliance. His voice was smooth, his tone self-righteous, as if he hadn't just condemned a man to die. "We must protect the hospital from exploitation," he said, straightening his tie. The room fell silent when Maria stepped inside, her voice cutting through the air like thunder. "You mean protect it from humanity?" she snapped. All eyes turned to her as she laid the donor card on the table. "This is the man you refused to treat, Elijah Brooks, the lead builder of our children's wing, the man whose labor kept this place standing when it was only concrete and dust." Gasps filled the room. The hospital director frowned, picking up the card, reading the name, realization dawning like dawn breaking after a storm. Maria's voice shook but didn't falter. "He begged for help and you let him die because of the color of his skin. You called him people like you, but without him, none of us would even have a hospital to work in." Dr. Collins's face drained of color, his mouth opening to protest, but no words came. The silence in the room was heavy, every heartbeat echoing in shame. A nurse entered quietly, holding a newspaper. The morning edition already carried the story. "Black man dies after being denied treatment at St. Martin's." Cameras were gathering outside. The truth had escaped the hospital's walls. Dr. Collins stumbled back, his reputation collapsing faster than any building Elijah had ever worked on. Maria looked at him one last time and whispered, "You took his life to protect your rules, and now those same rules will bury you." Outside, thunder cracked again and rain began to fall, not as sorrow, but as justice cleansing the sins that had soaked into those polished white floors. The storm that morning didn't stop the crowd from gathering outside St. Martin's. Umbrellas dotted the street like bruised petals, while reporters shouted questions over the sound of rain. Inside, the corridors that had once hummed with sterile calm now pulsed with guilt and unrest. Maria stood at the edge of the lobby, watching the faces of nurses, orderlies, and patients who had read the headlines and were seeing their hospital with new eyes. Overnight, Elijah Brooks's name had become a symbol, not of tragedy but of truth long ignored. News outlets replayed footage of the Children's Wing dedication years earlier, where a younger Elijah had stood in his hard hat, smiling shyly beside the ribbon, his son perched on his shoulders as he promised to build a place where every life matters. The same plaque still hung in the Wing's hallway, though few had noticed it until now. By noon, administrators convened an emergency press conference. Dr. Collins sat rigid, the confident posture gone. Flashbulbs flickered as questions flew. Why was a donor denied care? Why were procedures valued above compassion? His answers crumbled into half-sentences and excuses. Then Maria stepped to the microphone, voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She didn't speak of policy or blame. She spoke of Elijah's laughter on construction breaks, of the way he bought lunch for apprentices who couldn't afford it, of how he told her, on that final night, that this hospital would outlive them all if people inside it remembered kindness before rules. The room fell quiet, cameras lowering as if to listen instead of record. Outside, the rain softened. That afternoon, the board voted to remove Dr. Collins and establish a new emergency policy. No patient would ever again be turned away. They named it the Elijah Protocol. Donations poured in from across the city, some from people who had once doubted men like Elijah, all wanting to mend what had been broken. Maria returned to the Children's Wing, where sunlight cut through the storm clouds and spilled across the plaque bearing his name. She placed her badge beside it for a moment of silence and whispered, "You built this with your hands. We'll rebuild it with your spirit." Across town, Elijah's family watched the broadcast, his wife holding the donor card that had exposed the truth, his son's eyes wet but proud. In the weeks that followed, murals appeared on construction walls, showing a man in a hard hat holding a child high against a sky of steel and light. The words "Every foundation needs a heart" painted beneath. The story rippled through other hospitals, inspiring reviews of treatment policies, forcing conversations that should have happened long ago. Dr. Collins disappeared from public view, but his absence was its own reminder of what arrogance costs. Maria kept working, quieter now, yet stronger, carrying Elijah's lesson like a pulse beneath her skin. Sometimes when night shifts grew heavy, she would walk past the children's ward and see the glow of the new memorial garden built in his honor. Small, simple, filled with the laughter of recovered kids playing among flowers that grew where steel once stood. The hospital had changed. People had changed. The prejudice that once hid behind paperwork had been dragged into the light and dismantled brick by brick, the same way Elijah once built walls, with patience, with sweat, with faith. And as the city moved on, his story became more than a headline. It became a promise whispered through the halls. No more walls between those who heal and those who need healing. Years later, every time thunder rolled over the skyline, Maria would look up from her rounds and smile faintly, feeling that somewhere beyond the clouds, Elijah was still watching over the house he built, not with anger, but with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose work had finally found its purpose. The morning began like countless others in the city's vast rhythm, but beneath its surface something quiet and heavy waited to be seen. The clouds hung low, pressing a dull gray light over St. Martin's Medical Center, a place whose white walls were meant to symbolize purity and healing, but often concealed stories that would never make it to the evening news. Elijah Brooks, a senior structural engineer known for the bridges and clinics he had helped design across the state, arrived there not as a professional that day, but as a patient. For years he had ignored the fatigue in his chest, convinced that hard work and discipline could mend anything. When the pain finally refused to be silenced, he walked through those automatic glass doors expecting care, not judgment. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and bureaucracy. Faces moved quickly, clipboards shuffling, screens blinking. Yet the moment Elijah's name was called, the tone of the room shifted. Paperwork stalled, glances hardened, and an invisible line appeared, one drawn by skin, not by science. Hours passed in a waiting chair that felt colder with every minute, while patients who came after him disappeared behind curtains and returned bandaged, comforted, seen. He said nothing, only pressed a hand to his chest and watched the clock's second hand crawl forward. Eventually, an administrator informed him that insurance details needed verification. Elijah nodded, understanding the code behind the words, but he refused to let anger claim him. He had spent a lifetime building things to last. He would build patience too. Yet behind those doors, decisions were being made, quietly, efficiently, that his name would not move up the list. By evening, his world blurred into a fog of exhaustion and disbelief. But before despair could swallow him, another figure entered his story. Maria Santos, a junior nurse known for her empathy, had noticed the repeated deferrals on his chart. She began asking questions, simple ones that made others uncomfortable. Why had his vitals not been checked? Why were his test results missing? Each inquiry met a shrug until her persistence forced a senior review. The discovery was ugly. Files misplaced, forms unsigned, all under the direction of Dr. Collins, the department head whose obsession with policy hid a deeper bias. When confronted, he dismissed the matter with practiced detachment, claiming protocol and limited resources, yet the undercurrent of prejudice was undeniable. Word spread through the staff quietly at first, a murmur in break rooms and corridors, until it became a roar of conscience that could no longer be silenced. Maria documented everything, the timestamps, the neglected charts, the internal emails that revealed how many others had been deprioritized. She took them not to the press, but to the hospital board demanding transparency. The investigation that followed shook the institution to its core. Audit teams unearthed a pattern spanning years. Patients from certain neighborhoods consistently recorded longer wait times, more cancellations, higher denial rates. Data that once sat buried in spreadsheets now stood as proof of systemic prejudice woven into procedure. The revelation hit the city like a storm. News outlets ran the story for weeks, and the same building that had ignored Elijah's quiet endurance became a national symbol of reform. Protesters gathered outside with candles, not in rage but in collective grief for every unseen injustice that had unfolded behind clean walls. Dr. Collins resigned under public pressure, his career collapsing under the weight of the truth he had tried to rationalize. The hospital released a formal apology, yet Maria knew words alone could not rebuild trust. She proposed a new initiative, an independent review board named the Brooks Foundation, honoring the man whose patients exposed a system's fault lines. The program trained medical staff in implicit bias awareness, restructured triage policies, and partnered with community clinics to ensure equal access regardless of background. Within a year, St. Martin's transformed from a symbol of exclusion into one of accountability. The same halls that once echoed with silence now carried conversations about empathy, ethics, and change. Families who had once felt invisible began to return, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence that something real had shifted. Elijah, meanwhile, recovered slowly under proper care, unaware at first of the movement his name had sparked. When he finally walked through the hospital garden months later, he found a plaque beneath a newly planted oak tree bearing a simple inscription: "For every hand that builds, may another heal." He stood there for a long time, the wind moving through the leaves like applause from the unseen generations his courage had helped. The city would continue to struggle with prejudice. No single policy could erase history, but St. Martin's had become proof that institutions, like people, could change if confronted by their own reflection. Maria stayed on as a director of outreach, turning her defiance into education. Each year, new interns would gather under the oak for orientation, hearing the story not as gossip, but as a lesson in moral architecture. That integrity is a structure too, built one choice at a time. Years later, when reporters revisited the story for an anniversary piece, they called Elijah the man who fixed a broken foundation. He laughed softly when he read it. All he ever wanted was to see fairness stand where prejudice once did. The hospital's children's wing, once an afterthought, now bore murals drawn by patients, hands of every shade reaching toward a single heart, their colors blending where fingers met. The image became St. Martin's new emblem, replacing the sterile caduceus on its letterhead. From then on, each visitor who entered passed beneath a banner that read, "Care has no color." And as the seasons changed, the oak outside grew taller, its branches stretching toward the sky like the city's own act of repentance. The legacy of one quiet man had redefined what healing meant, reminding everyone that medicine is not only about curing bodies but mending humanity. Some nights, when rain whispered against the windows and thunder rolled in the distance, the nurses swore they could feel the building itself breathe easier, as if the weight of its past had finally lifted. The story of Elijah Brooks was no longer about a single act of prejudice. It was about how truth, once faced, can rebuild the very thing it exposes. It left the city with a question that refused to fade. If one man's patience can change an institution, what might happen if an entire world decided to listen before judging, to heal before hurting, to see before assuming? The answer perhaps is still being written, in every act of fairness, in every choice to do better, in every foundation laid not only with steel and stone,